Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Reshaping Supply Chains for a Post-Pandemic World. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Our speaker today is Yossi Sheffi. Yossi is the Elisha Gray II Professor of Engineering Systems at MIT, Director of the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, and the author of The New Abnormal. Yossi, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, everybody. This is a book that was written at breakneck speed, warp speed, you might say. I write, every 4 or 5 years I get a new book, and I was in about a year and a half into another book on logistics innovation in March, when supply chain around me was going through the biggest change in my lifetime. So since end of March until the beginning of September, kind of slept about 4 hours a night and finished the book with the help of 2 people and then the marketing team in my center. Anyway, let me quickly go through the book and go through some of the main ideas there. So let's start with, there are many disruptions, many possible disruptions. And Tolstoy wrote, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, in Anna Karenina. And every disruption comes with its own reasons and causes and miseries. No two are the same, but handling the management of disruption, of every risk and every disruption is actually similar, even pandemic. So let's see about what people did during the pandemic that was similar actually to many other disruptions. So good companies set immediately an emergency management center. It used to be, many companies had it in physical place, with a lot of screens, a lot of data. It all became virtual. Companies paid a lot of attention to communication. Good company communicated obsessively to their employees, to the customers, to Wall Street, to the market in general, to the community they're in. Very important to communicate, even when you don't have all the information. So frequent is much better than delayed, even if you say, I don't really know all the answers. Another thing that happened in the emergency management center is very clear decision-making authority. This is something that company have to worry about beforehand, because in a case of a disruption, lots of people are trying to help, lots of people are trying to get involved, and they, in fact, make the situation worse. So we call it swim in your own lane, or as Bill Belichick, who is the coach of the local football team, that's the American football, not the real football, is saying always do your job, don't do other people's job. Companies had to review suppliers to make sure who is still in business, who has capacity issue, who has quality issue. One thing that we saw in many recessions is a lot of subpar products are entering the market when companies very quickly try to get new supplier or press existing supplier for more capacity than they have. Companies in many cases have to review a system, and I'm talking in the book about a system to prioritize which product, which customer, which product gets built, which customer gets served when you don't have enough to fulfill all the orders. How do you decide which customer you should which product you should build and which customer you should serve? We're going into a recession, and as always, cash is king, but one has to be very careful in terms of supply chain, not to extend term of payment to supplier beyond the point that will make them, have an existential threat, because they also have a problem with cash. If they don't get paid, it can be a problem for the supplier. Many companies have done what we saw happening in other recessions, is reduce the number of SKUs. This was done at the beginning of the pandemic, even before the recession. Here, the example, General Mills reduced the number of Progressive soup from 90 varieties to 50 varieties. So the reduction of stock keeping unit, the reduction of variety helps in 2 ways. First of all, companies focus on the fast sellers, those that must be on the supermarket shelf. And also it reduces the cost of manufacturing because it reduces the changeovers. So you do less changeover, it's better for cost. And finally, good companies are planning for the recovery, and planning for the recovery by not letting, as they say, any problem, any crisis go to waste. They're planning by, it's an opportunity to get a tough look at the market you serve, at the customer you serve, at the division in your company, and the employees that you are with or going to do without. So companies are going to this strategic exercise. When we talk about the shape of the recovery, we see that actually China has gone through a V-shaped recovery. They went down significantly and up immediately. We hope that the rest of the world is going to a U recovery, going down and then up. It doesn't look like this. We just saw this morning, Germany, France, we're going to significant lockdown. Spain, Italy are not doing well. The United States is not doing well at all. So we may be more of an L and waiting more time for the recovery. Or some observer think it's a W going up and down. I think it's actually, we should look at the spatial dimension, and it's going to be more like a whack-a-mole recovery. What do I mean by this? The whack-a-mole is the game that moles come up and just hit them when they come up. There'll be random flare-ups, shutdowns, and reopening around the world because the pandemic is unpredictable. So at random time, random region, you'll have changes in supply, in demand, factory closure, people going home, whatever, and then it goes right back up. It's an issue that supply chain managers will have to contend with. Who did COVID-19 hit? We know that it hit in terms of people. It hit the old, people with comorbidity. With company, it also hit the weak company that already were not in good situation, over leverage. For example, US department stores were already going down from 1999. The revenue of all US department stores was about $30 billion. It was about $11.5 billion in December 2019. It's now way less than $8 billion when all these companies have been going bankrupt, basically. So how did company adjust to the new normal? Well, we saw a lot of companies were answering the call. For example, auto companies started making ventilators. Ford, GM, Flex, another, the large contract manufacturer also was making ventilators. Other companies were making masks. New Balance right here in Boston had, over a weekend basically started making masks. And this is yours truly wearing the New Balance mask. That's what it looks like. Anyway, Etsy, that has all this selling online, by April had 60,000 people selling masks on their system, and 3M tripled its production of the gold standard, the N95 masks. And companies did many other adjustments. For example, Burberry started to use an app when you can talk to a salesperson, mostly in Asian markets, can talk to a salesperson who will show you what item to use with what and match your clothing. Savas is a company in Nashville, Tennessee, who makes custom leather jackets. And what you see here is not each one of those actually a video that shows you how to take measurements, and they show you how to take measurements. You send it to them, and they send you a custom leather jacket. Again, going online. Sephora, instead of people going to the stores and having all this customer service representative applying the cosmetics and showing women how to use it, they move totally online. Again, showing people how to use it with videos and with chats. IKEA developed a augmented reality app that you can look at each one of their furniture items and put it in your room and see what this is going to look like. Again, moving online. In general, of course, e-commerce spiked, went to the roof. Whether I have some Q2 revenue, don't have yet on the Q3, but you see Walmart, for example, went up 9% in general, almost double in terms of e-commerce. Target tripled its e-commerce and so forth. And of course, Amazon, JD.com, Alibaba grew significantly from a very large base. Shopify, it's a company that helps small and medium-sized retailer to get online, double its customers, and has now, well, when I say now, by May, June, has 1.3 million customers. These are retailers, not consumers, online using their platform. We did some polls during June of this year, and of course, what was expected is home delivery went from 13%, people did it before, to about a third of the population. Interestingly, about a third of the population are going to stay with their choice. They like the new using more e-commerce and home delivery. We also are seeing that there's a new competitive advantage, new area of competitive advantage. After 9/11, we had to get people back to fly, so we went to the airport, what is now familiar, the TSA, all the checks. Actually, when you go to certain malls in certain countries, shopping mall, when you go to sport event, you get tested. Why? It allows people to start flying, allow people to start feeling confident. We're having the same things now post-COVID-19. We have to create minimal infection danger for area when people congregate, whether it's be a retail store, an office, a university, any place where people congregate. So what we're going to do, what people are doing is they are doing testing, of course, temperature testing, and quarantining those that are tested positive. It becomes a new competitive advantage. Companies that do it well can get much better, much faster back to having people where they want them. One of the amazing things that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic is the adoption of new systems. I interviewed a dozen of executives who this was uniform. Everybody said that the rate of adoption of the new system accelerated significantly. Company were talking about what they had planned to do in 2, 3, 4 years, they were doing in 2, 3, 4 months, just getting it done, whether it's connectivity or visibility of shipment and supply, all kind of optimization, big data, a lot of automation, and a lot of people moving to the cloud, which makes it, by the way, a lot easier to implement new software tools. So I'll give you one example of a company that actually does very well during the pandemic. Why? Because they help flexibility. Flexibility and agility are important when adjustment to any disruption and any change situation. So call it flexible logistics in a dynamic world. In other words, how can you compete with Amazon? The problem with the warehousing industry is that it's asset intensive with custom design. And meanwhile, as we say, e-commerce is surging and changing. It may or may not, as the pandemic subside, it may change a region of the world. At the meantime, and this is the US view, Amazon is dominant. It's difficult to compete with. So how do you compete against Amazon? And I'll show some of the difficulty. And you do it with certain platform. So how do you compete with Amazon? This is the estimate that Amazon today, the US e-commerce market share is about 800 billion, go to 1.2 trillion. Amazon will grow and is growing. Why? They have the widest selection. They have the lowest price. They have the fastest delivery. And they have the fastest delivery because to deliver fast and consumer want faster delivery, you need lots of warehouses. Warehouses have to be close to the customer. So look at Amazon. Look at the number of fulfillment centers that Amazon has, close to 200, as opposed to Walmart, Best Buy, Home Depot. Now, Walmart is trying to compete by turning some of the stores to deliver from store, but it is not very efficient to do it from store. So here and there, they're turning stores to a dark store, but this is just very small at this point. You can do fast delivery. You can do 2-day delivery with about 3 fulfillment centers in the United States. One day you require actually 15 or 16 fulfillment centers. For same-day delivery, you require hundreds, and they're to be close to the customers. So how can anyone compete with this? This is where Amazon has fulfillment centers all over the United States, close to population center, and they can serve most of the US population actually same day. So how do you compete with this? So turns out that some warehouses around the country have too much space. It's not used because of just startup, they didn't fulfill it yet, because of seasonality, business move up, business move down. At the same time, other businesses need more space. So they need it for a short time or for longer, for seasonality, changing configuration because they grow, they decline, whatever. So a company called Flexen, it's one example. The book has many examples of all kinds of adjustment. A company called Flexen has developed on-demand warehousing network. So they have agreement with over 1,000 warehouse and fulfillment centers all over the United States. And they put their own operating system side by side with the warehouse management system that this fulfillment center has already. And they do retail distribution, e-commerce fulfillment, and they can take care of inventory overflow. Why does it work? It's basically an Airbnb for warehousing or cloud computing for warehousing. So they have massive reach, 1,000 warehouses compared to Amazon, which is the biggest, has only 200 or less, 179 or so. If you want to use their system, there are no startup costs, and you don't have to use it everywhere. You want to serve people in Boston, so you use 1 or 2 warehouses around Boston. There are no fixed cost commitment. You pay by the flow. A big thing is they have the same technology platform everywhere. So you can have one view into your inventory wherever it is. You can open anywhere in the United States. Right now they operate only in the United States. You can open a fulfillment center and serve the community. And you have a centralized inventory view, I mentioned before. You can get up and running very quickly. And it offers flexibility. You can get in and out of market depending on your sales, depending on what's going on, without any fixed cost. You can also do one more thing. Let's say what will happen if I'll offer 1-day service in Cleveland at a certain price point? I don't know what will happen. It's very hard to forecast. There are no models for this. So maybe try it out. So I'll go to Flexen and ask them to run 2-3 warehouses around Cleveland for 2 months, put my product in there, start advertising it, and see if I get, what lift do I get from 1-day service, as opposed to 2-day service, as opposed to same-day service, whatever. And they offer also fulfillment services, they book transportation, real-time visibility, and a lot of analytics. Anyway, this is just one example. Of course, this company does very well, and they develop a lot more when situation is fluid, when there's a lot of uncertainty and dynamic effects. Let's now change gear and talk about what happened during the pandemic, and specifically some of my big point is the media, talking about failure of supply chain, talking about the end of just in time, talking about the end of reliance in China. None of this is actually happening. In terms of failure of supply chain, I would say this was their finest hour. Think about the food supply chain, changed completely. The food supply chain, in one day, there were no restaurant, no institution, no universities, no industrial park, and all the food that was going in bulk to these places, not customized in small packages with all the information on them, all the regulatory information on them. So this is half the food in the United States. But not only this, at the same time, there was a change in the item consumed at home. People stay home and they start buying less fresh food, more canned food, more what we call comfort food, bread and pasta. With plant closure, and still the food kept coming. Now, sometimes you didn't have the cut of meat that you specifically like, or the granola bar that you liked very much, but you had other stuff. It was not out of, you didn't have to go hungry really. And the problem is that the media had this picture. And I took, I called to some of my friends in certain publications, asked them, why did they do it? And I said, I know what you did. You went in the evening and took this picture. If you go to the same supermarket in the morning, this is what you see. Because what you don't understand is the cadence of fulfilling supermarkets and stores and retail outlets. A truck leaves the warehouse overnight with a lot of pallets of the stuff. From midnight to 5, 6 a.m. in the morning, people are breaking the pallet, putting the stuff on the shelf. So when people come in the morning, that's what they see. But because of all the headlines, people were panicking. I should say that there was one area that was real shortage, and this is PPE and medical supplies. But I look at this more as a failure of governments rather than failure of companies, and we can talk about it more. So I would say supply chain managers acted, deserve the trophy. The end of just-in-time is not going to end. Just-in-time is, people use the Toyota production system as a, they talk about just-in-time, what they mean is the Toyota production system, but it's a very important supply chain, manufacturing supply chain innovation, almost comparable to the Industrial Revolution. So it calls for minimum inventory, but it also results in resilience and flexibility because people are connected to each other, suppliers, manufacturers, customers. It actually, the most important thing, resulted in high quality because you didn't have a lot of inventories. You could identify flaws and errors in the in process and in part. It resulted in low waste, avoid bottlenecks and controlling variability. It resulted in worker participation. So the result was low cost and high quality product. And if you are a little on the older side, you remember that Toyota and Honda were offering voluntary quotas when selling to the United States because they were going to decimate the entire US auto industry. So, and they were using this time. And we can talk later about, you can actually, in the book, I explain how to run just-in-time system with emergency inventory. Out of China, again, I don't think so. Many companies are not in China only to low cost, diminishing advantage, costs are going up. Those that there are, like garment manufacturer, have been moving out of China to other Asian countries, to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh. But interestingly, those have been moving just the last stage of production, the cutting and sewing. Textile is actually, more of it is being exported out of China. Also automotive, high-tech, aviation, sophisticated industry relies on Chinese suppliers. They're just too good. And over time, companies have invested decades in developing a whole ecosystem of supplier and sub-supplier and their supplier in China. It will take decades and billions of dollars to move out of China. And these supplies are not easily found elsewhere. And some companies may balance procurement in China with what they call China plus one strategy, having some incremental investment out of China, but also some Western suppliers are going into China and other countries in order to balance investment in the West. Finally, let's remember that China is still a very large and growing market, and companies cannot afford not to be in China. So I don't see a lot of companies moving out of China. Let me just quickly go to some issues of concern following the pandemic. The first one is sustainability. Paul and some of the listeners know my view on sustainability, that a lot of people, despite what they say, are not willing to talk and not willing to pay for it, which means that companies cannot invest, government cannot make it happen. It becomes, as we go into bad recession, it becomes more of a luxury good. And my fear is that people will pay less attention to sustainability. Even though I must admit, in the book, I have two parts, one pessimistic and one optimistic about the future of sustainability post-COVID-19. We may have more work from home. There may be new white collar globalization, because if my office is in Boston and I can work from Buenos Aires or Delhi, I may not want to be in Boston, and some companies may hire people around the world. One of the sad things is a lot of inequality exposed. We talk about the K recovery. People, white collar people who can work from home are doing just fine, versus service people in factories, warehouses, driving trucks, in retail stores are not doing well and losing. In addition to this, there's a lot of inequality between countries. Countries in Africa, countries in parts of Latin America and part of Asia are moving backwards in all kind of metrics, economic, public health, in all kind of societal metrics. So also inequality between countries is growing. Politics, we see the rise of populism and nationalism and choose the leader that you want to focus on, but it seems to happen around the world. We see industrial concentration, the big are getting bigger, and mainly I'm talking about tech companies, whether it's Facebook or Amazon or Google, and I don't see a solution for this, despite some recent move by the U.S. Justice Department. The U.S. law simply is not conducive to the current monopolies. The fake media, the fake news. You cannot listen to the news because now we cannot even agree on the facts, let alone on opinion. So how are we going to move out of this? I don't know. And finally, the next pandemic. This pandemic is bad, but is not nearly as deadly as Ebola or some of the SARS variants that are much more contagious and much deadlier. The mortality rate of COVID-19 is unfortunate, but not very high. And I hope when we get out of this pandemic, we're not going to feel that the problem is solved, and we'll get ready for the next one. So let me finish here. This is, you see, some of all my last books. The 3 ones on the bottom are dealing with risk and resilience, with emphasis on supply chain, but in business in general. You can go to my website, it has a lot more information, a lot more webinar and blogs and whatever, so you can enjoy it. So with this, let me stop the presentation and turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Yossi. There's an awful lot for us to chew over there. I'm going to invite you to turn on your camera, and we'll move into the Q&A. I want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions via the questions module in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. We've got quite a few coming in already. So where should we begin? Yossi, it's one thing to act in a crisis, to revamp on the fly, as you've described, in order to survive and maybe even prosper, as some have, against these dramatically changed conditions. But when we turn our attention to the more permanent changes in our operations, things become a lot more complicated. For one, when do we act? When will we know enough about the world to return to long-term planning, especially given the unknown shape of the recovery? Or is that question entirely missing the point?
The question is not missing the point, but I think the lesson from this, and by the way, past disruption, is that you have to invest in flexibility. That, as they said, the only thing that's permanent is change. And we are going into a period that's even more volatility. One can think about, regardless of who wins the US election, but we see what's going on in Europe, we see what's going on around the world. And the problem with global warming, the problem with trade wars, the problem with political opportunism. There are so many issues that impact supply chain, especially global companies who are working with global network, that one has to have, when one make plans have to be rooted in scenario planning. You have to go in and start saying, okay, in so many years from now, we can have this scenario, this scenario, this scenario. Now, it could be that none of this scenario will happen, but going to scenario planning, socialize the organization to think in terms of change and have what we call markers in the ground to see where are we trending and can we see where we are leading. But it cannot be we have a plan, a rigid plan. This is this is disaster. So you have to have a certain scenario and build several plans actually.
So clearly, flexibility, scenario planning, they're the new black when it comes to organizations. But are there other traits or capabilities that are becoming either more important or perhaps less important as we think about the new abnormal?
Yeah, companies are investing tremendous amount in technology. Clearly, automation, drones, autonomous vehicles, all of these have two effects. First of all, they are making companies more efficient, faster respond. They're also, by the way, making inequality worse by throwing a lot of people who cannot work off, all of the service people off jobs. So this is clearly one trend, both good for companies but worrying society in general. We'll have, a lot more pressure from companies. Will have a lot more pressure on a lot more issues, and they worry about over revenue and costs, and now risk management is becoming a big deal. Let me just mention about risk management and resilience. I'm talking to many companies, many suppliers in particular, who say the customer is coming to us and wants us to be more resilient, wants us to have multiple suppliers, wants us to have more inventory. The only one problem, they're not willing to pay for it, and that's a problem. The problem starts with the consumer, who's of course not willing to pay for being anything but low cost, good product. Anything, I don't know, I forgot. I think I lost the line of your question now.
No, it's all interconnected, right? We're talking about supply chain. But let's stay on that point for a moment, because as you mentioned in the kind of the second to last slide, I think it was, and kind of the areas of concern. You talked about sustainability and with respect to luxury goods in particular, but since you've kind of returned to that, is if we have seen a strengthening of cost as the determining factor in purchasing decisions during the pandemic, is that, should we view that as permanent? You said that you saw a case for and a case kind of against sustainability, and you describe it in the book. So let's talk about the case for a little bit. This is near and dear to my heart, of course.
I know, and I should have expected this question. So knowing our mutual history, but let me talk about some of quickly why pessimistic and optimistic. Pessimistic because, of course, less attention, talk about it, nobody will have the money to invest, government will not have the money to invest, countries who are getting, beggar thy neighbor, me too, are going to create ill will. And the point is that both global warming and pandemic are similar. They're global problem, they require global cooperation, and as you know, they require investment in technology. So let's see the parallel. What happened in COVID is that we went to technology. Once we went to this regular solution, changing people's behavior, it doesn't work. People don't change, despite really life and death, they don't change. And so, as I always argue, they also don't change for sustainability. So in the pandemic, we went to develop vaccine and therapeutic. In global warming, we already had some success in technology. Renewable costs are coming down, and that's great. It's just not enough. We'll have to invest in getting GHG, greenhouse gas, out of the air. And there are technology for doing this. And now the good news. When the chips are down, when we saw real danger, we invested in the economy, in dealing with the pandemic, trillions and trillions of dollars. If we invest just a small amount of this in the technology required, but we see that money is there. Let me tell you one more thing that I think is positive. We should have listened to the expert. I'm not even talking about Bill Gates or medical experts. In the book, I give example of 7 or 8 covers of Time magazine that talk about the coming pandemic. There were also dozens of covers that talk about global warming. In both cases, in the pandemic, we saw H1N1 and SARS and Ebola. They were warning before. If nobody can see the warnings right now, they're blind. The warnings are there. The experts are telling us that it's coming. The scientists, the engineers are all telling us that it's coming. So I hope that in the pandemic, we learn to listen to the engineer. We learn that money is available if the problem is large. And lastly, we had actually, while we didn't have much cooperation between countries, we had lots of cooperation between scientists and engineers. In fact, the genome of the pandemic was replicated over 1,000 times around labs in the world. So such cooperation can also bring technological help for solving global warming. Anyway, that's my optimistic side.
I much prefer the optimistic side, but when you think about the
Don't
parallels,
we all?
what it took for us to understand what a pandemic could do, one shudders to think of what the climate parallel might have to be.
Yes.
But that's it.
But we see the start. We see the fires in California. We see the hurricane season right now in the United States. It's one of the worst that we ever had. So the signs are already here.
Well, they clearly are. And let's hope that we are learning some lessons from this, as you say. Let's talk about technology, which is quite present, right, in your talk and in your work. Is it too late for laggards, say in IoT or real-time analytics or AI adoption now? Has the pandemic kind of created a gap between those companies that had made the smart investments in technology and those who have not, that's insurmountable, or is there still hope?
I don't think it's insurmountable. And the reason is that the availability of, first of all, of the cloud, going to a lot of application in the cloud, which means that you don't have all the integration and all the time that it takes. Second, you see your competitor doing something. Now, let's look, for example, Domino. I'll give you one example. Domino Pizza developed app that you can order your pizza and you come to the stores and they follow your GPS and you come with your car, somebody comes around, put the pizza in your trunk. Domino is up 16% year over year, and several of the competitors, Pizza Hut, California Pizza, are out of business. So clearly they did not invest in time. However, if you are still standing, it means that you're not in totally bad situation. You can, because the time to application exists, they are good by and large, and you can work through the card. So I don't think it's too late. I think you should move, as one of my least favorite administrations says, in warp speed. So that's how you should move.
Have any technologies kind of emerged as more important during the pandemic, or were emerging and maybe have accelerated?
Everything was accelerated. It's hard to think about something that was not there before, but everything accelerated. We see a lot of companies adopting visibility, try to find where the stuff is, try to look at companies, try to make sure they have a good look into what the suppliers are doing, so they have an early warning if stuff is not coming to them. Moving to the cloud, of course, lots of no optimization method. But I think if I have to rank them, visibility was number one, certain optimization, and automation, RPA, robotic process automation, automating office function is big right now. So all of these are moving fast.
When we think about companies' ability to manage operations remotely or semi-remotely during the pandemic, has there been a particular kind of revelation, right? Or have you seen, like, I can't believe we actually can do X this way?
Oh God, yes, absolutely yes. And in the book I have many examples, but let me talk about a small example. A local, family shop that used to serve, they have 20 trucks, about $50 million business in Chelsea, north of Boston, that used to serve institutions, restaurants, in full truckload. The business, they lost 97% of the business. The only 3% was prisons. They still serve prisons. What do? These are people who never knew how to write a website, how to send an email. I know this because I used them. So then I used them in the book, because I found out about them from my son. So anyway, they started beginning at the PDF list on a website of the stuff that they have to give. And then about 4 days later, they had pictures of the stuff. but you still had to call them because they didn't they didn't have a way to take. About 4 days later, you could click and get the orders. About a week later, they had tracking and tracing. Then they start sending email. It took them about 2.5 weeks to completely move from serving institutions, which is entirely different, and serving consumers. And these are people who are not technology. They didn't have, the wife was the technology, the chief technology officer, and she kept her job and had 2 kids at home. So to me, it was an example of how determined and flexible, and they rehired everybody that they had to lay off at the beginning. So this is kind of a heartwarming story for me. I have the whole section in the book about them, because it's the adjustment, the necessity is the mother of invention, and you just do what you have to do. Of course, large companies can do it in spades. If Unilever move instead of making a lot of cosmetics and other stuff, that started making disinfectants, and big companies were able to move. They have the resources. But for me, it's the small companies that were adjusting so nicely. That kind of nice story.
Yeah, it's a great story, but it shares in common, of course, with some of the remarkable things that large companies have been doing. Yes. They are externally facing, right? They're reacting to changing customer needs or changing business conditions. What about thinking about looking internally and not letting this crisis be an opportunity missed with respect to improving business process?
Yes, so good companies are doing it. They're using, as I say, don't let the crisis go to waste. And they're looking at a lot of things. They're looking at the customer they serve, at the market that they're in, at the type of suppliers. They're under pressure to reshore. Some do, most of them don't, but they have to justify what they're doing. They're subject to new political pressures. So companies are adjusting internally in terms of, as I said, market, regions of operation, products. All of these are being adjusted. They're also adjusting HR. It's an opportunity to see who can work under pressure and who cannot. Another interesting thing that is not going to go away, or 2 things that are not going to go away. First of all, once you do something and the company changes and or adopts something quickly, you cannot go back, because the excuse, oh, we have to check 3 times with the CFO and this and go through all this goes away. Hey, we could do it in 2 months. So why are you taking me 6 months to do it? So this is, some of these things are not changing, because even the psyche that things can be done is a very powerful motivator to keep doing things faster and better. So I think that's a very important facet of what happened during the pandemic.
Great, thank you. We have an absolute flood of questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to start kind of picking things somewhat randomly to throw your way. Are there any dark sides to resilience or maybe flexibility? In other words, is there a risk that companies will kind of over-index on being opportunistic and flexible during a crisis and live to regret it later?
And what?
And live to regret it later. In other words, can you go so far towards flexibility that you lose sight of what is sustainable over the long term, from an operational standpoint or a competitive standpoint?
Sure. Because what you do, there's always risk in moving too fast. For example, one risk: you adopt all this software very quickly. You don't pay enough attention to cybersecurity. I mean, you open yourself in the future to other risks. You approve something very quickly, and later on you find out that you have a problem. It doesn't work because it didn't go through all the checks. The quality is not what you thought it is, because you had to do it quickly. So one has to recalibrate following the pandemic. I hope you don't go back all the way. You realize things can be done fast, but you have to make sure that they're done right at the same time. And I understand that during the pandemic, right or wrong, fast sometimes is more important than anything. Not in the long term. In the long term, hopefully you get faster than before, but also quality and customer service and all of this still keep in good shape.
So what does this suggest about the cadence of our planning, right? I think, there's already been a huge amount of pressure on kind of traditional, say, annual budgeting cycles, right? And for a lot of organizations, that's been anachronistic for decades in some cases, but others not, right? So is it, if you're still operating kind of, and not thinking so much about operational planning, but financial planning, because you can't really disassociate them.
Of course.
How much pressure is there on organizations to start engaging in different planning cycles?
It's actually a lot of it depends on the industry that you are in.
Yeah.
If you are in long clock speed industry, whether you build aircraft, you build even automobile, it's very hard to do monthly or quarterly cycles. If you're in retail, if you're in fashion, you better do quick cycles because the market is changing. So it really depends which industry you are in. But in general, there is pressure, but I don't know if, as I said, really depending on the industry.
How much stock do we put into what consumers and workers and business partners are telling us today? And let me be more specific. Consumers and workers are both saying that their behavior has permanently changed. They want to work from home more. They want to shop from home more. You referenced this. They want to have more delivered. But how reliable should we view that sentiment in the moment? It's pretty risky to make too big of a bet on how people are feeling as they live through something so completely new and unfamiliar. Might there be a V-shaped recovery with respect to behavior?
The answer is, of course. People in the middle of the pandemic, and you see some companies are very careful. Look at the difference between Korean Airlines and Delta. Korean Airlines is the only airline that was profitable during the last few months because it basically changed to a cargo airline. Delta, American, United, they say, man, we're not sure how long it will last. It's very expensive to take the seat off, to put it back on. And I understand. It's the uncertainty. So now when we talk about consumers, its psychology is even harder to decipher. But what companies are telling me, that's what I report in the book, with interviewing dozens of executives, that they do continuous polling among their employees. And they said, for example, work from home, there are basically two types of employees. The employees that love work from home, the employees that hate it, that they need the camaraderie, the working together on these companies. When I talk to companies like Google, they said it's not what people like or not, but depending on the job. They have a problem with design new products. They said this, we need the engineer in one room on one big whiteboard. It's not enough to work from home and the tools are not nearly good enough. We need them to commute. So, and I heard it from several companies that innovation, anything that tied to innovation, they're going to bring people back whether they like it or not. Now, it may be hybrid, maybe not every day, but they're going to bring people back. So it's depending on the job and depending on the psyche of people. Some people are, introvert. They like to be home. Some people cannot withstand, being at home and not seeing colleagues, not seeing people all the time. So the answer, like a classic professor, my answer is it depends.
Well, let me give you another question that's probably impossible to answer because they're the most fun. If we think about kind of industries, I'm coming and looking for a scale of uncertainty, right, with respect to how the future, assuming that we emerge from this pandemic and are able to, whether we do or not, are able to engage in a lot of the behaviors that we associated with life and work pre-2020. If maybe on one hand, you have remote conferencing technology right over here and the aviation industry over here as two that have been profoundly impacted for better or for worse. What industries do you think really are, industries in between there? What are the ones that have the most uncertainty about how the recovery or how the new abnormal will impact them?
First of all, let me say one thing certain about the aviation industry, because there are many, many cases, there are trends that are just being accelerated during COVID. One trend in aviation was going up and it's going down and it's not going to coming back anytime soon, and that's business travel. Not so much economy travel, but business travel. As you know, I have centers all over the world, and I used to go to a board meeting in China and spend 4 or 5 days for a 2-hour meeting. Now I spend 2 hours for a 2-hour meeting and about $20,000 less. So it's hard for me to imagine that I'll keep going to all of these cases. And why will companies approve it? Why do companies agree to do it? In the middle are the people who are most facing uncertainty are certain retailers. We see restaurants going out of business big time. Hotels, interestingly, some of them are doing okay. Again, changing the business quickly. You see hotels in Boston hosting students. They are basically operate as dorms for students. So they find niches in order to work during the pandemic. But companies were not very large. I don't worry about even GE. GE has a problem because they're selling to the aviation industry, but they have resources. It's exactly the same problem that countries. The US, EU, China, Japan are going to do at the end. They're going to do fine. They have the resources. The problem is Africa and South America and countries that don't have resources. The same thing. Small companies who did not move fast are in danger and are going out of business. But it is so industry related because, as you know, in some industries business is going down, in others it's going to the roof. So you have two types of demand problems to deal with, and the places where it goes down have to pivot, have to change, and those that change either get online in some fashion or go to an adjacent area like flying cargo instead of flying passengers, are those that are making it. But uncertainty is there to stay, right? Do we know about the vaccine? Do we need 1, 2, one every year, one every 6 months? Is it going to be 50% effective, 80% effective? We don't know. So it's a lot of uncertainty for everybody.
Yeah. So as we, I don't want to use phrases like come out of this, as we just move into the future, right? Perhaps a future that's somewhat more predictable, maybe just this much more predictable than it is today, who knows? Is there any reason to think we might see consolidation in certain supply networks and supply chains?
We always, it happens naturally because of recession. So some companies the fate is not handling it well, and the stock price is going down. It presents an opportunity for the strong companies. That kind of happens in every recession. It has said in the tech world, you see companies are buying smaller competitors. That's actually acting monopolistic. So this is beyond what is good for everybody long term. But absolutely, we always see consolidation, but then it's an accordion effect. We see consolidation, and then people are offering, new people come, people are offering more services. Sales people start selling, oh, we need to offer this variant, that variant, more services, grow. So it will happen here as well.
In a presumably less predictable world, I'd like to talk for a minute about kind of companies' relationships with their customers and their supply chain partners. As you mentioned in your presentation, and as you've written about, right, companies face some very difficult choices about prioritizing customer needs. Whereas at time they may have been able to satisfy their entire suite of customers during the pandemic, there were times when they could not. That relationship permanently changed. And I think this is a tough question, but I'm interested in kind of two things. How a company thinks about its own self-preservation versus those of its partners, and how they have conversations with customers when they have to make choices of one over another. Can you go to a customer and say, we're actually not going to serve your needs right now, and actually expect to have an ongoing relationship with them?
No. That's very tough to go to a customer and say, I know you have orders, but I'm not going to build the part that you need, and good luck. However, it's really interesting. Earlier this morning, I had another webinar with Converse and with their supplier in Southeast Asia. Converse part of Nike, and a whole host of suppliers in South Asia. And some of these questions came up. And this was, the OEM was there and the suppliers were there. Yeah. My point was that companies that did it well, first of all, decide who to serve or not to serve. The people that you decide not to serve in a crisis are people it's very hard that to think you have a long-term relationship, and that may be good. Maybe it's the wrong customer. Maybe you don't want to serve this customer. Maybe when you look at the fully loaded cost, this customer is not even profitable, and it's not likely to be profitable. Okay, so you cut down the customer. You have to think about both short-term, your preservation, sometimes you have to do it, and long-term relationship. And I give the book a 2x2, management school type decision matrix, how to go about it. But the self-preservation is important. The main issue is not to do it abruptly and to have conversations. To have conversation between customers and suppliers to say, look, this is my situation. I can give you only 50%, but this is what I'm doing. So continuous relationship, don't leave people in the dark. And suppliers who have this relationship were doing well. In addition to this, we found out that the very important element is trust. You have trust and long-term relationship, that supplier will serve you or do their best to serve you. If they cannot, they talk to you and explain what they're doing and when they can serve you. So, in fact, during a crisis, a trust is being challenged sometimes because of this, because we don't have enough. And we saw cases that are awful. We saw some garment sellers sticking really suppliers who cannot afford it with canceling orders even after the supplier bought the raw material. Well, my guess is that sometimes things will change and the supplier will be in the driving the relationship, and then remember. So it is something that some companies, not too many companies did it. I saw good companies were absolutely taking care of suppliers, talking to suppliers all the time. The suppliers were doing the same thing. But what was done to those garments, sewing and cutting and sewing in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, was really pathetic. And companies who did not have to do it did it anyway. So, too bad.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, and there's some interest in two particular technologies that the audience would like to hear your thoughts on with respect to their importance going forward. The first is digital twins, and the second is blockchain and distributed ledger technology.
Digital twins is something that I expect will be more and more important because it lets you try doing scenario planning operationally. How are we going to operate when this is the situation, that is the situation, something is happening, something is not happening. So digital twins, it's basically a simulation technology. You simulate what the situation will be like, and I expect this to be more important rather than less. Blockchain is the perennial 3 years from now is going to be important, and it's always going to be 3 years from now. So the technology right now is, even though it's used here and there, it's just not ready for prime time. It's too slow, and it's not clear that you cannot achieve many of the benefits of blockchain with just regular distributed, storage. So distributed databases. So it's just not clear to me that the time is to invest big in blockchain right now. But let me just tell you, when people ask me to forecast future of technology, that Niels Bohr say it's very hard to forecast, especially the future. So.
Yes, indeed. And on that note, Yossi, thank you very much. This concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Yossi Sheffi, and thanks to our sponsor, Amazon Business. Enjoy the rest of your day.